Victor Hugo was right when he said there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Yes, the idea of freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Yes, that was the idea, but I declare that now is the time. And if America is going to have a chance at living out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then we cannot afford for this nation or its leaders to have selective ambition.
Welcome to the Policy Lowdown, the podcast from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, offering straight talk on the policies that matter most to the Maryland communities. I'm your host, Kevin Slayton. As the dust is still settling from the Maryland's 90-day legislative session, I'm excited to once again welcome the entire Maryland Center on Economic Policy team here in studio to talk about what the Maryland General Assembly did this year and what that means for all of us and our communities. The state budget matters every year, but this session was different as the budget was dominated by significant proposed cuts. In our last episode, we focused more in depth on the Fair Share for Maryland Act and the taxes and fees that the legislature ultimately would use to help balance the budget. So let's kick things off with our very own research analyst, Christopher Meyer, who can share some of the major highlights from this year's budget and what's ahead for the state finances. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. Governor Westmore had to address a budget shortfall when he introduced his proposal for the next budget year. How did he address it, and how did legislators respond?
So the first strategy he used was to draw on reserve funds and other one-time sources. In a similar vein, the governor's budget increased borrowing rather than cash for construction projects. It's normal to use a mix of cash and borrowing for construction projects, and the state's borrowing does remain within a sustainable range. However, the governor also proposed some cuts to public services. His budget proposal included $23 million in cuts to community college aid, which included a permanent reduction to the formula for that. It also included some restrictions on the child care scholarship program to allow waiting lists in the future, as well as increased copays. The governor did propose some new programs around his priorities, such as funding for the Enough Act, but those were generally pretty modest. So the legislature did restore or reduce many of the proposed cuts in the governor's budget. And as you talked about on the last episode, the legislature's adopted budget also increased some tobacco taxes and vehicle-related fees to support transportation and education. Finally, the legislature authorized additional use of state reserves to balance the budget, particularly for responding to the Key Bridge collapse, which happened toward the end of the budget process.
Makes sense. Looking ahead, what can we expect in future budget years, Chris? More specifically, though, did the actions this session taken by the governor and the legislature address any of the long-term issues we see?
Some of them. So the legislature's actions did largely address the projected shortfalls in the Transportation Trust Fund. However, we're still facing a $1.7 billion general fund shortfall for next year, and then more than $3 billion beginning in the 27-28, but we're still facing a $1.7 billion general fund shortfall next year, and then more than $3 billion each year beginning in the 2027-2028 budget year. That means lawmakers and the governors face a stark choice. They need to either pass a more significant revenue package like the Fair Share for Maryland Act, or they can choose to cut deeply into public services. And we need to be really clear that there's no third choice. There are no realistic alternatives to revenues or cuts.
Thanks so much, Chris. Well, we'll come back to you a bit later, so don't move. I want to talk to you about policies that are affecting working people in Maryland. But for now, I'd like to turn to our policy analyst, everybody's favorite, Taneeka Richardson, who's our lead on housing policy. Welcome back to the show, Taneeka.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Great. Housing was another policy area They got a lot of attention this year as evictions have been on the rise, and many Marylanders are struggling to afford the high cost related to housing. And so Governor Moore introduced a package of bills that were aimed at increasing the amount of affordable housing. And there were also several other proposals that renter-led coalitions supported this session, many of them which you worked with, Taneeka. Can you share what was passed this session?
Yeah, so sure. So basically, quite a few things did pass. I'll start with the governor's bills. So two of his bills that focus around housing were the first one was related to funding that was focused on increasing construction around affordable housing. The other one was the Renters' Rights and Stabilization Act. So this bill created, it did a multiple of things, but one of the things were it would create an office of tenant rights so that renters in the state of Maryland would have one centralized place where they could go to on the state level to kind of know what their rights are, what landlords can and cannot do. Another good component of that bill was limiting the amount of security deposits, because right now I think in the state of Maryland, well, previously to this bill passed in, I don't believe there was like a cap on the amount of security deposit a landlord could charge. I think they could charge up to 3 times the contract rent. But what this bill did was limit this amount of security deposit that a landlord could charge to 1 month. So that's going to be huge going forward. The other one was the eviction prevention funding. If you guys know and you listen to other podcasts, that's something that we have kind of been trying to work on and trying to get each year since COVID has kind of subsided and the pandemic has kind of went away. So a lot of folks thought that it wasn't a need. However, due to a lot of push and a lot of work with state advocates, we were able to get $10 million allocated from the budget that will assist families and community schools with eviction prevention.
That's huge, and it sounds great, and we should recognize the progress that was made there. But as always with each section, Taneeka, what other things that you all worked on that didn't actually get over the hump?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we were not able to get just cause eviction passed. So that was really a Debbie Downer. So basically, just cause eviction would have made it illegal for landlords just to randomly not renew a tenant's lease. They would have had to have good cause or a good reason to not renew that lease. So unfortunately, that did not pass. I'm pretty sure we will continue to push that again next session. The other bill that did not pass was the Tenant Possession Recovery Act. So basically, if this bill would have passed, it would have made sure that people who were evicted would have had access to recover their belongings, right, before they were removed from the unit. Another thing that we are still going to be working on going forward is the eviction prevention funds for community schools. It is a great start, but there are many families who could still benefit from eviction prevention that wouldn't qualify what basically would pass, right? Because we have families who maybe don't have children, you have older adults, or you may have families who don't even attend community school, so then that would be an issue. So those families wouldn't qualify. And again, like I said, it's a huge need for this because we saw a huge drop in the number of families that was being evicted when we had access to these funds. So the evidence is there to support a broader range program for this.
So thank you, Taneeka, for getting us up to date. Again, affordable, safe housing is so critical for our overall economy. Now let's talk to our friend Jasmin on our staff, who's been focused on a few other issues related to economic security for families. Welcome back to the show, Jasmin.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, leading up to this legislative session, we had a couple of conversations about the Access to Care Act, which, drum roll, please, let's hear it. Did it pass this year? And if it did, can you share more about this legislation and why it's so important?
Yes, of course. So the Access to Care Act, which did pass this year and which our partners at Casa de Maryland have been trying to pass for a couple of years, requires the state to apply for a federal 1332 or what's called a state innovation waiver that would open up the state's health exchange. Here in Maryland, that's called the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange, to Marylanders, regardless of immigration status, to purchase health insurance. And the state must apply for this waiver by July 1st of next year, so 2025. And then if approved, the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange must adopt regulations to carry out the program by January 1st of 2026. So this bill really opens up the opportunity for more Marylanders to be able to access health insurance, specifically in our immigrant community who, for many reasons related to immigration status, are often excluded from accessing health coverage and thus have a high uninsured rate. So looking ahead, it will be important that the state is able to apply for this waiver as soon as possible. It's also going to be important to ensure that everyone who is eligible to buy insurance on the exchange has the ability to afford it. So the federal government allows people who benefit from the Affordable Care Act and within, of course, certain income limits to be eligible to receive subsidies that lower out-of-pocket costs. And as currently passed, the bill did not appropriate funding that would make costs of insurance more affordable to these newly eligible enrollees. So while this bill is definitely a win, we still need to continue advocating for affordability and funding moving forward.
That's great news. Congratulations to you, Jasmin, on all your hard work, and particularly to our friends over at Casa de Maryland who've been working on this legislation for the past several years. But if I'm correct, there were also some adjustments to public benefit programs that were proposed during this session. Can you share more about those bills?
Yes, of course. There were definitely some modest changes to public benefit programs this legislative session. So, for example, when it comes to the SNAP program or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, households receiving SNAP in Maryland are currently eligible to receive the state's supplemental benefit if there is a member in their household who is at least 62 years old. Lawmakers passed HB 666, which lowers that age from 62 to 60, and it also increases the supplemental amount to ensure that these households are receiving at least $50 a month, up from $40 a month. The bill originally set out to eliminate the age limit and increase the supplement to ensure that the households were at least getting $95 a month, but it was stifled by the reality of the state budget. There was also proposed limits on benefit theft replacement that did not pass. As you may know, there was a rise in electronic benefit transfer card theft, or what's known as like EBT card theft across the country, including here in Maryland. And families use these cards to access SNAP and cash assistance. And because of that theft, it ended up leaving many of these families unable to afford enough food or pay rent and bills on time. HB 1434 tried to make the replacement of these benefits or the restoration of these benefits subject to available funding, setting up a scenario in which some families could get reimbursement and others could not. But thanks to the support from advocates and some legislators, the bill passed only in the House and died in committee in the Senate. Now the state agency should focus on continuing to improve security measures on these cards, which not only will help reduce costs over time, but also ensure that the burden does not fall on low-income Marylanders.
Yeah, real quick, Jasmin, with HB 1434, with it not passing, I'm assuming it's going to come back next session. Is there any particular area, I mean, clearly on the Senate side, but any particular area where our listeners can begin to sort of push to help it sort of get over the hump next year?
Well, with the state budget, there's no guarantee that this will come up next session. But again, it's important to ensure that we as researchers and in support of also our community advocates, that we are able to lift up the voices of the families that are directly impacted by this policy and ensure that we are able to convey the message that the families are entitled to these benefits that should be replaced on time and with enforced security measures moving forward.
Well, thanks so much again, Jasmin, for those updates. For more on policies that are critical for children and families, I'm going to now turn to Nonso Umunna. He's MDCEP's Kids Count Director. Nonso, so glad to have you. You've been on here several times. Welcome back.
Always
You're
a
like
pleasure
a
to be with
regular,
you,
man.
Kevin. Always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, there are a lot of different factors that affect the well-being of children and families here in the state of Maryland. What would you add to what we have already discussed so far?
Well, Kevin, unfortunately, unlike Taneeka and Jasmin, I don't have a lot of positive news. The policies that we discussed leading up to the legislative session, like expanding working family tax credits and healthy school meals for all, didn't pass this session. Maryland's End Income and Child Tax Credit was a very important tools, as you know, for reducing child poverty, and there were additional proposals this year that would have strengthened them. Unfortunately, given the state's budget, like Jasmin was mentioning, those didn't pass. Similarly, the Healthy School Meal for All program didn't pass as well, largely due to expected cost. The bill would ensure that students across the state are able to get school meals for free without parents having to fill out paperwork or facing the stigma of being labeled as low-income students. As we know, no child should have to be hungry or face hunger while in school. But it's not all negative news. This session, the legislators passed an amended bill that requires the State Department of Education to do a study on the benefits of universal free school meals and produce a cost estimate for implementing such a program. The General Assembly did pass one of Governor Moore's proposed bills focused on reducing childhood poverty and put a little funding behind it. The Engaging Neighborhood Organization, Union, Government, and Household Grant Program, or the Enough Act of 2024, which seeks to reduce child poverty using multidisciplinary and neighborhood-specific interventions. The bill requires the state to study neighborhood indicators of poverty and analyze how states are measuring poverty. It will also provide grants to support anti-poverty initiatives in select communities. And the legislators approved $10 million for the Enough Act, a bit less than the governor asked for.
Thank you for those updates. It sounds like there's still some major community needs we can address if we are to reform our state tax system, and as Chris was discussing earlier, so that we have the resources to do these things. Sounds like there's still, though, some major community needs that we can address if we reform our state tax system, as Chris was discussing earlier, so that we have those resources to do these types of things that we've been discussing. I look forward to having you on the podcast soon. Based on your history with this show, I have no doubt you will be back, particularly to inform us on the Kids Count data book that is soon to be released this summer. And now it's time for the man, the myth, the legend himself. I want to introduce us to the research assistant, brother Musaab Ibrahim, who focuses on policies related to the criminal and legal system. Welcome, Musaab.
Thanks, Kevin. It's good to be back, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, good to hear your voice. I think the topic we heard the most about during the legislative session was issues around youth justice, and particularly some legislation around youth justice. Can you share more about how we got there and what happened during the session?
Sure. So to just back up a little bit to understand what happened this session, we need to go back to 2022, where the legislators passed significant reforms to state policies determining how children are treated when they're accused of breaking the law. This mainly focused on getting children more additional help and community support to deal with the issues rather than having the juvenile courts deal with the issues. So due to significant media coverage, creating this false perception that youth are committing more crimes and other various political pressures in Maryland, many of those policy changes were reversed this session. The big policy, the big bill being the Juvenile Law Reform Bill, HB 814, which altered many provisions of the juvenile justice restoration reform omnibus bill that was passed in 2022. For an example, they reinstated the ability for 10 to 12-year-olds to be charged with more types of crimes, and they expanded the use of probation. There was many discussions in the General Assembly this year around whether these bills were rushed through or whether they didn't consider the natures of the crime, and there were many discussions between the juvenile excuse me the
DJS.
yes, DJS, sorry, thank you, and legislators around there's much confusion around how the laws and the policies would affect going forward. So they ultimately led to reversing those policy decisions from the 2022 fiscal year. On a more positive note, the bill does require more oversight and data collection of the state's juvenile justice system. So that should give us better information to base policy in future sessions.
Well, definitely gives us something to be on the lookout for, but not just us, other youth advocates, particularly around these particular policy areas. Were there other notable policy changes affecting the criminal legal system, Musaab?
Yeah, there was a few bills there was one bill actually that addressed fines and fees for our incarcerated residents in Maryland. One of those bills was was House Bill 531, which repealed parole supervision fees and drug and alcohol abuse test fees. Just to give a brief overview, these fees, when you're on probation in Maryland, you were charged a monthly $50 fee for the cost of probation, and also fees for the drug tests that you must perform under probation. The legislators this year repealed those fees as they were very the fees levied upon incarcerated individuals was much less, versus the fees collected there was a big disparity. And so I believe there was only about 10% of the fees collected from these individuals versus the actual fees imposed. So it was good to see that the legislators repeal those fees for individuals, giving them funds to help them, not go towards just these fees, and these fees also went towards the General Assembly, and they just weren't being collected that much, so it made sense to repeal them.
Well, thank you, Musaab. Before we wrap up, let's go back, as I promised, to Chris Meyer to talk about policies affecting working people. Chris, from what I understand, there were not any major labor policy bills like we've seen over the last couple of years, but there were still some very meaningful policy changes. Can you share some of the things that did pass?
Absolutely. So we really made some important progress on, we could say, less front page, but really meaningful priorities. The first of those being two important transparency bills. The first being pay range transparency. That means requiring job postings to include the expected salary range for the position. And that's important, first off, just for giving people seeking work the information they need to make an informed decision, but it also helps us fight discrimination by preventing employers from lowballing women workers or workers of color. And that's a bill that Jasmin Aramburu, who we just heard from a minute ago, worked really hard on. The second transparency bill has to do with workers' pay stubs that they get each pay period. And this bill requires employers to include really basic information on workers' pay stubs. Things like, what is the hourly wage and what is the number of hours being used to calculate that total pay number for that period? What is the identity of the legally responsible employer? And that really basic information is really important for preventing and reducing wage theft. So after those two transparency bills, there was also legislation that made some changes to the state's paid family and medical leave law, the Time to Care Act, to support implementation of that program. So that legislation did make some positive progress in helping the state implement the program and administer it effectively. Unfortunately, those changes also pushed back the start of benefits by 6 months because the Department of Labor needs additional time to get their systems up and running. So now people will be able to begin claiming paid family and medical leave benefits through the public program in July of 2026. Another major area that we made progress on is ending misclassification for home care workers paid through Medicaid. So as our population continues to age, there's an increasing need for long-term care for people who need assistance to really perform just daily activities. And home care workers provide that really important care in the home. Thousands of home care workers historically have been misclassified as independent contractors. And that allows the home care agencies that employ them to get out of their responsibilities to, for example, pay minimum wage. Mm-hmm. It allows them to shift taxes from the employer onto workers. But this year, we finally, after several years of trying, ended that practice through Medicaid. And then finally, there were bills that passed to strengthen state and local workers' collective bargaining rights, such as for the first time allowing library workers across Maryland to join together in unions and negotiate for fair wages, benefits, and working conditions.
That's outstanding. Well, let's look at the other side then. Were there things that did not pass this year that you'd like to highlight?
Yes, there are, Kevin. The first of that is one fair wage, which means phasing out the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. Today, restaurants and other employers that have workers who receive their pay partly through tips are allowed to pay them as little as $3.63 per hour. And in theory, tips are supposed to make up for the rest so that they receive the full minimum wage. But one, that doesn't always happen because of unscrupulous practices. And two, it means that they wind up with low wages and customers actually wind up, in a sense, tipping the boss. Mm-hmm. So that's a really unfair practice that we have been working hard on ending both at the state level and in several local jurisdictions, but so far we have not succeeded with that. The second is legislation to modernize our unemployment insurance system to make sure that it's actually paying enough money for unemployed workers to keep a roof over their head and put food on the table while they get up on their feet. That legislation also makes sure that the unemployment trust fund that pays benefits has enough money in it to stay solvent, and helps with good matching to make sure that workers have enough support while they're looking for a job to make sure that they can actually get a job that matches their skills rather than just the first thing they come across. Finally, there was a bill to require fair scheduling in the largest retail employers, hotels, and chain restaurants. So that essentially just means that the employer has to give workers a schedule a couple weeks ahead of time to make sure that when the employer adds additional hours to the worker's schedule, that they're compensated for that and have the opportunity to decline those new hours, and ensure that there is some basic compensation when the employer takes away hours that were previously scheduled. Unfortunately, that bill did not pass, which is too bad because fair scheduling is important to make sure that people can plan their lives, engage with their families, maybe pursue education, or juggle multiple jobs. So those three bills we are definitely going to be continuing to work on next year and in future years if necessary.
I'm confident with you doing what you do so well, Chris, that we will eventually make the progress that is so needed. I want to just first thank every one of you who works for the Maryland Center on Economic Policy for your commitment and your passion and your time for the work that you've put into this 90-day session. I know oftentimes it's last minute that you've had to sort of bring things together and sort of express and share your knowledge so that those who are voting on these policies could be better informed. And while Jasmin, Taneeka, Chris, Musaab, and Nonso are all doing their work, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge two of the more finer folks within the office as well, our director, Benjamin Orr, and our feet on the ground. She's a mad woman down there, Callie Schumitz. Our hats goes off to her. But again, thank you all so much. Again, the entire MDCEP research and policy team for joining me for this conversation today. Of course, it was a busy legislation. I thank you for helping all of our listeners get a better idea of what their elected representatives did or did not do during this 2024 legislative session. To those listening, you can find podcasts, archives, and resources from this episode at mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email list or support the Policy Lowdown by making a donation to the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. But you can also find the Maryland Center on Economic Policy at MD Economy on Threads, MD Economy on Instagram, MD Economy Twitter, and MD Economic Policy on Facebook. Thank you again for listening. See you all next time.
Kevin, I think you also deserve thanks for the work you do both hosting this podcast and advancing our priorities in Annapolis. So let's not forget to acknowledge Kevin's contributions.
I'm going to pay you right after this, Chris. Thank you so very much.
I second that.
Thank you all. See you on the next one.
Those that would stand up, call our nation back toward justice and righteousness are often bashed or labeled as socialist and unpatriotic.